Good morning, all of you that joined us. We're going to just take a few more minutes and let more of our attendees get online. So if you could bear with us, I would greatly appreciate it. I hope everyone is doing well. And today is Thursday, not Wednesday. Everybody's week's messed up with the holiday. Well, I think we're going to get started because time is valuable. Thank you all for coming. I'm Diane with the Windham Region Chamber of Commerce. I'm happy you could join us today. Many people have been asking questions on issues about reopening, coming back to work, especially employee issues. And we are very fortunate to have as a member of our chamber, Updike Spellacy. That is a fantastic, phenomenal firm. Bonnie is our local contact, Bonnie Kumiega. And I want to thank you and all of the attorneys in your firm for being here today. We know that you are very busy, and we greatly appreciate the fact that we have so many of you and all of your expertise here to answer our questions. So once again, thank you all for being here. Bonnie, do you want to say a few things?
Well, thank you so much, Diane, for having us and hosting today. And I thank my partners and colleague attorneys who are here with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bonnie Kumiega. I'm a shareholder at the law firm of Updike, Spellacy for the firm's corporate and commercial finance departments. My law practice focuses on representing businesses and business owners in business and commercial matters, including land use, zoning, business succession, and estate planning, mergers, acquisitions, corporate assets, and real estate-based finance. Also with us is Chris Brigham, a shareholder with the firm and the chairman of the employment practice group, focusing his practice on representing and counseling schools and businesses with respect to workplace and employment law issues. He defends clients in a wide variety of employment claims in both federal and state court. Mr. Brigham also represents and counsels clients on matters before the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, the Department of Labor, and the Workers' Compensation Committee. Also in our labor and employment practice group is Valerie Ferdone. She's an associate in the firm. Hartford office, Ms. Ferdone concentrates her practice in the areas of professional liability, insurance coverage, and defense litigation, serving as an advocate for legal and accounting professionals in both the state and federal courts. She also handles business disputes in the firm's commercial litigation group. Attorney Richard Corella. Rich is a shareholder at Updike Spellacy in the Middletown, Connecticut office. Attorney Corella's law practice focuses on representing municipal entities, businesses and business owners in government affairs and commercial law matters, including land use, zoning, business succession planning, employment issues, mergers, acquisitions, corporate asset and real estate-based financing, and commercial litigation. Attorney Richard DeGello. Rick is a shareholder in the firm's litigation department and chair of the products liability and toxic court practice group. Since joining the firm, Mr. DeGello has focused his practice in the area of products liability, asbestos defense, toxic torts, construction law, and commercial litigation. He also serves as the vice chair of the Greater New Britain Chamber of Commerce. Jonathan Canestri is an associate at the firm and is a member of the tax, business, estate planning practice groups. Mr. Canestri advises businesses on a variety of general corporate matters, as well as federal and state income tax matters. Mr. Canestri also represents public agencies and banks in commercial lending transactions. Now that we've introduced our team, I am so excited to bring you our first speaker, Chris Brigham.
All right, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Diane. And welcome, everybody. I'll be fairly brief because I know we have a lot of questions to get to today, which we're happy to try to answer. For us, this is, we're about to enter our third month of this, and the landscape continues to evolve and to change, but Valerie and I are sort of busy counseling clients on return to work issues now, which is the good news. The more difficult news is that, that too comes with its own set of challenges. We continue to see a lot of overplay or interplay between the state unemployment compensation scheme and the federal benefits that are now available, especially the PUA and the FPUC. The FPUC is, as you know, is that $600 supplemental benefit. And Yeah, what seems to be happening now is a couple of things. One, there's some resistance to return to work due to the beneficial federal supplemental benefits. And so we field a lot of questions about, I've got employees that are refusing to return to work because they're concerned about coming in and they want to stay on unemployment. Too difficult to sort of broad brush that, but generally that's not going to be an acceptable reason not to come back to work. And if you're in that situation, you should, consult with your counsel, certainly dialogue with your employee, find out exactly why he or she is not returning to work. It could be for a legitimate reason, i.e., that they need to stay home with a son or daughter whose school is closed, or that they're symptomatic with COVID or caring for someone with COVID. But generally, the explanation that I'm perfectly feeling good about receiving unemployment and concern to come back to the workplace is not a sufficient reason. As we return employees back to work, all of our workplaces are not the same places that they were 2 months ago. We're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing, clients calling and saying, look, I want to bring everybody back, especially, and Rich will talk about the PPP forgiveness piece of this, but I want to bring my employees back, but I just don't have, the hours for them, for instance. And what we're advising clients in those situations is, get your employees back to work to the extent that you can, even if it's on a part-time basis. I mean, A, you're allowed to do that, and B, if they come back part-time, there is the possibility that you bring them back on a part-time schedule, and that they can claim what we all know is partial unemployment. And the Department of Labor is saying that's the best thing to do. On the Connecticut Department of Labor website for your employees, they are required to notify the Department of Labor that they've been returned to work. And it's a lot of easy click-through information for them, but essentially there's a section on there under the unemployment section where they can click on a return to work icon, and it'll allow them to provide the Department of Labor with the information that they're being returned to work on a particular date, and that they're being either returned full-time, which will most likely make them ineligible for continued unemployment benefits, or they're being returned on a part-time basis. The key is that they have to, if they're being returned on a part-time basis, they have to continue to file for weekly benefits and disclose, the amount of money that they're being paid by the employer for the part-time schedule. So it is lawful to bring them back and change their schedule. I know that question's been asked, but you need to communicate that with the Department of Labor, and you need to communicate that with your employees. Another option that we've seen utilized is, as you probably recall, way back when in April, we talked a lot more about the shared work program that the Department of Labor is offering. That is still, that's still legitimate, and it's still available. And some employers we're seeing are now, rather than doing the partial unemployment, they're returning a workforce back to work, but then applying for the shared work program so that they can bring the folks back part-time, but then also allow them to collect unemployment through the shared work program. So that's sort of a quick overview of where we stand with unemployment issues. We're now seeing a lot of activity again with the Family First Corona Response Act. As you recall, again, back in April, that became effective April 1st, but now, and there was a lot of sort of a flurry of activity initially, but now we're seeing it come back into the picture because many employees are unable to return to work due to reasons that may give them a basis to be eligible for Family First Corona Response Act leave, whether they are sick with COVID, whether they've got a family member with COVID, and or they have a son or daughter whose school is closed. And in those situations, again, you're returning your employee back to work. They should no longer be on unemployment, but essentially you're returning them to work and putting them out immediately on either paid sick leave or the extended family medical leave, depending on their reasoning. So those are two sort of areas that we see. I know that there were a ton of questions that were sent in prior to the webinar. So I thought today, rather than listening to me, we could sort of each give you a highlight summary and then turn our attention to your questions, if that's helpful. So I'm going to turn it over to Valerie, and Valerie's just going to give you a quick summary of the non-essential workplace guidance that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name is Valerie Verdun, and I work with Chris in the Labor and Employment Practices Group at Updike, and Spellacy. Again, I'm just going to go over give a brief overview of some of the highlights of this, the reopening guidelines that became effective on May 20th, 2020. Again, these apply to non-essential businesses. There are some groups that have been able to continue to be opened this whole time prior to May 20th. So those businesses follow a different set of guidelines, but anyone who is part of this Sector 1 reopening will abide by the Sector 1 guidelines. One of the main points of Lamont's order was that all of these non-essential businesses who can open must keep their capacity limited to 50% of what their normal capacity is. So in order to accomplish this, it's important for business owners to consider who they really need to bring back, who can work from home, and taking into account individuals who are in high-risk groups, such as those over 65 or those with pre-existing conditions. There's no blanket rule that you cannot bring back someone over 65, but it's important to consider that when you're thinking about who you think would want to continue working from home and having these dialogues with your employees. It's also important to not make these decisions on a discriminatory basis. So again, getting together and having like a policy that's going to apply to your reopening is important so that you're treating your employees fairly, and also just keeping the lines of communication open with the employees. You can also stagger your return to work dates as we move forward in this pandemic. It's assumed that capacity of 50% will rise, so you will eventually probably have more of a full staff, but at this time, just bring back the people that you need in order to abide by that 50%. It's also important prior to reopening, or if you are opened, to do it now, is having written policies that incorporate these rules that are laid out in the sector guidelines. It's important that your employees know that you're taking these seriously and how the workplace is going to look. It's going to look a lot different than when before this happened. So appointing someone as like a program administrator who's accountable for implementing the rules and following the changes, that'll just help you maintain consistency and also keep a record of what you're doing to ensure that you're abiding by all of these rules. We've been getting a lot of questions about masks, it's such a big part of what's come out of this. And employees it depends really on how your office is set up. If you're able to socially distance with walls, like if you have individual offices or cubicles that have walls that separate, employees can remove their masks if they are in that enclosed area. If you have more of an open floor plan, employees will have to continue to wear masks at that time. And also, even if your employees are moving out of their office, if they're going to the bathroom, hallways, they are required to put their masks back on. So it's kind of like taking these rules for what we've been living with every day and kind of seeing how it fits into your workspace. All the employers are encouraged to try to rearrange your offices so that you can maintain the social distance of 6 feet in between employees. The 6 feet isn't in between the desks themselves, it's the employees. So have furniture that's a little closer together, that's fine. Just employees have to be 6 feet apart when they're working at their workspace. That is what else have we been? We've also been getting questions about workplace shifts and reorganizing. If you have employees that work in different shifts, you can try to move from maybe like one or two shifts to 3 shifts in order to keep the amount of people that are exposed to each other to a minimum. And I think that is it for the highlights, but I want to save time to go through the questions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich Corella.
Great. Thank you, Valerie, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the changes and most recent guidance for the PPP loan. There was an interim final rule. This is the regulation that the SBA puts out. There were 2 interim final rules issued late Friday night before the holiday weekend, at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. So, we really didn't start to look at this until Tuesday this week. And it didn't make a lot of changes to the frequently asked questions that we've been watching and the guidance that had been issued kind of along the way over the past few weeks. But and most importantly, it did not change the 2 big issues that everybody's wrestling with on the PPP loan forgiveness. It's the 8-week window within which you have to use the PPP funds, and then also this issue of spending at least 75% of the PPP loan on payroll costs in order to qualify for full forgiveness. And so there's been some tweaks to that, but those 2 issues really haven't changed. We are watching. I think a lot of people are watching the federal government. There's several bills pending right now in both the House and in the Senate that would extend that 8 weeks to perhaps 16. In one case, there's a Senate bill that pushes it out as long as 24 weeks. And some of those would eliminate the 75% rule. We're just watching those. And I think it's important to realize that at the moment, you can't kind of hang your hopes on that and anticipate that that's going to happen. Continue to operate under the existing rules and to the best of your ability in order to get full forgiveness. Spend the PPP money on what it's intended for under the current rules, and then we'll see where it goes on the legislative side. So there was some clarification in the interim rule that talked about when the 8-week period starts. Prior to the interim rule, it started on the day that you received the funds. That's now changed. If you have a biweekly or a weekly payroll cycle, that you can start the 8-week count when your next payroll cycle begins. So if you got it on, the 5th of the month and your payroll wasn't until the 10th of the month, you start the 8-week count on the 10th. That when your payroll cycle starts. It also clarified that bonus and hazard pay are eligible for loan forgiveness, and also qualified that if you had payroll that was accrued, perhaps uncashed checks by employees, that the PPP funds could be used to cover those, and that would be eligible for forgiveness as well as part of your payroll costs. It also clarified that salaries and wages to furloughed employees are also included in payroll costs. It also had clarification about the loan forgiveness available to owners who are also employees of their own company, and self-employed individuals who had their own PPP loan. Specifically, it can't be more than 8/52 of your 2019 compensation. So in other words, 8 weeks out of 52, which is about 15.38%. So the amount of loan forgiveness that you can ask for as an owner employee is for your 8/52 of your 2019 compensation, or the greater of that, or $15,385, which is 15.38% of $100,000, which is the cap anyway. So that was clarified a little bit. And then also, it did also clarify with regards to non-payroll costs, the ability to qualify for loan forgiveness if, for example, a utility bill might have been incurred prior to the time that you received the loan, but paid during the time that the 8 weeks within which you had the loan. As long as it was incurred and then paid before the next regular billing date, you can still include that in the costs that are eligible for forgiveness, even if that date is outside the 8-week window. As long as it was incurred and billed during that period of time. There's the loan forgiveness application went out around May 15th. And, banks are starting to wrestle with that now. For some loan recipients, they got their loan as early as perhaps the first week of April. You're really starting to look now at calculating the loan forgiveness amount, because it's going to be, your 8 weeks is up probably the first week of June, roughly. So, you do have 60 days after the end of that 8 weeks to apply. And then banks also have 60 days to review your loan forgiveness application. And so we're advising clients is to not rush into this. Do it thoughtfully, do it accurately, take your time, talk to your lender, and also, let's see what happens at the federal level. There might be some more guidance or some more flexibility than is existing at the moment. And so, you have a 60-day window after the 8 weeks is up to apply for the forgiveness. And then, you should take that into account, and then again, talk with your lender. That's kind of it for now. I know there's some questions on this in terms of calculating, full-time equivalencies and part-time, and we're happy to answer those as we get through the discussion. We want to leave time for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan at this point for some tax aspects of that.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks everyone for joining. There's just a few tax updates, so I'll keep my comments brief and then I'll hand it off to Rick shortly. Just as a reminder, the big tax benefit associated with the PPP loan is that the loan, if forgiven, doesn't result in the recognition of gross income. So that's really a key point. And as we discussed last time, the IRS did issue notice 2020-32 on April 30th. And unfortunately, there's been no update on that since we last discussed it, but we continue to monitor it. And if you remember, that IRS notice stated that to the extent you use your PPP loan for expenses that are otherwise deductible, and your loan is then forgiven, the loan, while not taxable, the deductions attributable to the loan are no longer deductible. So please just keep that in mind and be aware that there could be some undesirable income tax consequences associated with your PPP loan forgiveness. But if you don't get a PPP loan, there are some new benefits available to employers in the form of tax credits that I'll just briefly cover. Remember, if you get a PPP loan, you cannot claim these credits. It would be considered double dipping. So these credits are for sick leave, caring for someone with coronavirus, and caring for children due to daycare or school closure. You can apply for these credits and the $5,000 per employee wage credit that we have covered in the past, but you cannot use the credits towards the same wages. They have to be applied towards separate wages paid to employees. Again, no double dipping allowed. So under that first credit, the credit for sick and family leave, an employee who is unable to work, including telework, because of coronavirus quarantine or self-quarantine, or has coronavirus symptoms and is seeking a medical diagnosis, they're entitled to paid sick leave for up to 10 days or 80 hours at the employee's regular rate of pay, or if higher, the federal minimum wage applicable or state minimum wage applicable, up to $511 per day, but no more than $5,110 in total. The second credit under the caring for someone with coronavirus credit, an employee who is unable to work due to caring for someone with coronavirus or caring for a child because the child's school or place of care is closed, or the child care provider is unavailable due to coronavirus, that employee is entitled to paid sick leave for up to 2 weeks, up to 80 hours, at 2/3 of the employee's regular rate of pay, or again, as was the case with the last credit, if higher, the federal minimum wage or the applicable state minimum wage. That credit is up to $200 per day, but no more than $2,000 in total. And lastly, under the care for children due to daycare or school closure credit, an employee who is unable to work because of a need to care for a child whose school or place of care is closed, or whose child care provider is unavailable due to coronavirus, is also entitled to paid family and medical leave equal to 2/3 the employee's regular pay, up to $200 per day and $10,000 in total. The IRS actually has a very helpful page on this. It's entitled New Employer Tax Credits. So I would recommend you check that out for more details on these particular credits. That's really, at this point, the only tax updates that I have to share. So I will hand it off to Rick DeGilla. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still a little before noon. Again, I'll be brief as the others were, so we have time to answer the questions. I know that we've already seen a lot of questions coming through. I wanted to touch on 3 issues that we've discussed before, but just to give you some updates on those. The first being fraud under the Paycheck Protection Program or other programs. The federal government continues to make arrests throughout the country for people who who were fraudulent in submitting their applications for the Paycheck Protection Program. In a lot of instances, the conduct has been pretty egregious. It's people who have essentially made up businesses out of whole cloth, or had businesses where they were the sole employees, and then said that they had, several hundred employees and received, amounts of money in the millions of dollars. I'm assuming that either in some instances there were whistleblowers who let people know, or perhaps the lenders may have tipped the federal government off once the application went through. But there are, IRS task force, the SEC is involved, the Justice Department. Obviously they're taking this very seriously. Any kind of fraud claim. Right now, it's mostly in the application because people haven't been looking for the forgiveness yet. But there is a case of that I saw this week of a Hollywood producer who immediately deposited his paycheck protection money into personal accounts and used it to pay off credit cards and an automobile loan. And he's already been arrested for using those funds for improper purposes. So we discussed previously that the best thing to do is to just keep very careful track of how you spend these monies. Make sure you're spending the monies for eligible matters. And while you don't necessarily have to keep a separate account, if you have a means of keeping good track of your payroll and other expenses, that's fine. But if there's any concerns and you can't keep that money in a separate account and pay from there, that may just make things easier if you're ever audited. The federal government had come out initially and said that there's a certain safe harbor provision for loans under $2 million. Companies will be assumed that there was economic necessity for getting those loans. So the government won't be looking at loans under $2 million as to whether or not that was a proper calculation, but they'll still be looking at all loans $2 million and over and $2 million and under if there's been any fraud associated with it. So again, just be smart, be careful, and make sure that you keep things well documented and you don't try to cut corners here. This is not the place to do it because the government's looking very closely at all of this, because we're talking about trillions of dollars that have been that were pushed into the economy very quickly and without all the safeguards that normally would be associated with this. So they're going to be looking at on the back end and pulling out all the stops to make sure that they get their money back if it wasn't supposed to be issued in the first place. The second thing I wanted to update on was business interruption insurance. Again, we talked previously about the fact that the COVID-19 situation would normally not be something covered, at least on its face, that would be covered by business interruption because those policies generally require there to be some type of property damage. And there are also, in many of the policies, there are virus exclusions to coverage. However, I think the best course of action is to notify your broker and make sure that you put your insurance company on notice. If your business was shut down, if your business was slowed, if you were an essential business but you were slowed down, if you feel that you had any kind of economic or income loss over the last several months, there's state legislatures that are passing laws trying to require insurance companies to honor these policies. And, and the courts haven't had a chance to rule on any of this yet. So you don't want to be in a position where you didn't at least put your insurance company on notice that you might have a potential claim. It's not hard to do. Just talk to your broker. Your broker may discourage you from doing it for the reasons that I stated, that it's not a typical business interruption loss claim, but you should push that. Make sure you put the insurance company on notice. It just requires you to send them a letter, which your broker can help you with. And then from there, you'll most assuredly receive a denial pretty quickly. And just keep track of, documentation is everything in these instances. Keep good track of what you think, the monies you lost, the lack of customers, lack of revenue, other things, so you can support a claim if it gets to that point in the future. And so that's it. And the last thing I want to talk about, something that's becoming more and more important now that businesses are opening up is potential liability and what you can do to avoid liability, as to whether it's employees coming back to work and claiming to get sick, or customers coming into your premises and claiming to get sick. There's really nothing particularly different about protecting your customers from the risk of COVID-19 than you would do from other risks, from a trip and fall or other things. You want to make sure that your premises are safe, that you're inviting customers into a safe environment. But for the particular instance, we're talking about the COVID, just do your best to follow all the guidelines and to document what you're doing in terms of cleaning your property, your business, making sure that your customers are social distancing. If your employees are required to wear masks, make sure that they're doing that. Make sure if you're a restaurant that you're only doing the outdoor dining and that you're not letting people come in and sit down to eat, and all things of that nature, which are just good, smart business practices. Just make sure that you maintain those and that you document what you're doing in that regard. That's going to be very important if someone does make a claim, or if somebody, I saw there was a question, if someone calls the state and says that a business isn't complying with the guidelines, you want to have some documentation to show that you are actually doing that. We've been getting some questions from businesses about whether or not they can have either employees or customers sign liability waivers. There are many businesses that already have people sign waivers when they come in. Gyms and other types of similar businesses will have people sign, as a matter of course, or you take your kids to one of the trampoline facilities, something like that. People are used to signing waivers for certain activities. It's yet to be seen whether or not a waiver that would exclude a business from liability for someone contracting COVID-19 would be valid. And you have to balance, do I want to have my customers come in and sign all these waivers if it's not something I would normally do? There's a question of, there's certainly a question of whether they would be valid. It's not something that the courts have had an opportunity, to rule on yet, because there haven't really been any claims in that regard. It certainly will be difficult for people to prove where they contracted the disease. If someone's out, obviously if someone's out frequenting your restaurant or your place of business, then there's a good chance that they're out in a lot of other places, and it'll be very hard to tell where they contracted the disease. As far as having employees, there are some businesses that I've seen, most notably the New York Stock Exchange required their employees who were returning this week to sign liability waivers, protecting the stock exchange from any claims that employees contracted the virus. I think that may be a difficult one, because you can't contract away from workers' compensation coverage. And I think that, again, this is something that it would, at first blush, it looks like this would probably be covered by workers' comp if someone were an employee of a business and they contracted the disease, because workers' comp does cover occupational illnesses. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover everyday common illnesses such as colds or flus or things of that nature. Again, due to the difficulty in proving exactly where you got it. But if there was a situation where there was perhaps a cluster in a place of employment or something of that nature, where it can be proven that the illness was as a result of being employed in a certain place, then there might be coverage there. I don't think there's anything that would particularly exclude the possibility of workers' comp. So again, these are really all things that need to be considered on a case by case and on a specific factual basis. But they're all possibilities that businesses can consider based on your particular circumstances. That's really all I have now, and I think we can open it up to questions.
Well, thank you all very much for those comments. For those of you that are listening or watching, you can put in the chat section any of your questions, but we do have quite a few that people sent in ahead of time, so I'll start and ask you. Do I have to test my employees every shift? Do I have to take their temperatures, or do they take them? How do I manage the daily employee health check?
Yeah, you don't have to, but you're allowed to. So yet to be seen how different employers are handling this. Some are testing employees at the start of each shift, but that's going to be based on the availability of the testing and your ability to do that. Certainly, a lot more employers are doing temperature checks every day, but it's not a requirement that you do that.
So if I'm taking a temperature check, what is the documentation? Do I have to keep record of every employee and what their temperature was, or that it was high or low? And do I keep them in the personnel files? What do I do with this information?
Yeah, that's really confidential medical information. So no, you don't keep it in the personnel file. I don't know that you need to keep documentation of a negative test. You'd probably want to keep, or a negative temperature, you may want to keep it of a positive. I mean, it's going to turn into a whole lot of information, but I think you have some flexibility in how you handle that. But if you do decide to keep the documentation or a record of the tests that that you conducted, that should be maintained separately from their personnel files in a separate medical file that's kept confidential.
Okay. If my employee says that they're sick and I send them home, do I have to pay their wages while they are out? I think you covered this.
Yeah, so depends on, I mean, it's a little bit too general of a question. If they're sick with COVID, or are they sick with, some other.
I think they
Yeah.
meant COVID because.
Yeah, probably COVID, right? So if you send them home because they're sick with COVID, I mean, if they're symptomatic, let's just take the fact that they're symptomatic, they have some respiratory issues, they've got a fever, you send them home, it depends on whether that employee is exempt or non-exempt. As you know, for exempt employees, you have to pay them the same wages every week, same salary every week. So unless you have a sort of bona fide sick plan, you could send them home and ask them to utilize sick leave or demand that they utilize sick leave. The other possibility is they might be entitled to, the paid sick leave under FCRA. But with a non-exempt employee, they get paid for the hours that they actually work. So you don't have to pay them, but you could require them to utilize sick leave, or they may be eligible for the Family First leave.
Okay, so my employee comes up to me in the middle of a shift and says, I have some symptoms. I think I need to go home, and I send them home. If they have the symptoms, do they have to stay home for a 14-day period or self-isolate or anything like that? Or, if they're feeling better the next day, can they come back to work? And do I need to have a doctor's note saying that they don't have COVID or any kind of testing?
Yeah, I think Valerie, we talked about this a little bit. If they're symptomatic, I don't know, is it that it's required that they quarantine for 14? But
I think if they have COVID, so if they're symptomatic, they should get tested. And I think you would stay home until you have the test results.
Okay.
I mean, if you test positive, then it would be a 14-day period. The CDC kind of tells employees to talk to their doctors about their symptoms, because you as the employer aren't going to know if you can't diagnose them.
Right. So some people are experiencing this already, and for them to get an appointment with their doctor, it's taking sometimes a week or 2 weeks just to get an appointment to get the test, for them to prescribe the test. So they should stay out for that whole period of time until they get a test and they're negative, and then they can come back. And
Yeah.
should they show you the negative test and bring that in like a doctor's note kind of thing?
It's not required. I mean,
Okay.
I think you can take an employee's word for it if they say that it's negative.
Okay. Let's see our next question here. who do I have to report this to? Do I have to report it to anyone? OSHA had guidelines about reporting COVID, all COVID cases or suspected cases.
It's,
That would be
yeah, go ahead, Valerie.
your local or district public health agency.
Okay.
They're the ones tracking all the cases in the state.
So I don't have to report that to OSHA for any reason.
I'm not aware of a requirement for OSHA. Are you, Chris?
No, but I think, I mean,
Yeah,
you've got to keep a record of it in a confidential medical file, but I think the requirement is the local health agency.
Okay.
Yeah, I think with respect to OSHA, if you're a company that's required to maintain records, maintain OSHA records, and I think you have to continue to do what we would normally do to keep your records, including that. I mean, OSHA has been issuing some new guidance over the last week or so. So people who do generally report to OSHA should make sure that they're up to date on what they need to report.
Okay. And I think we covered the fact that it could potentially be a workers' comp claim. I did talk to the chambers, for example, our carriers, just out of curiosity, and basically our commercial liability, our workers' comp, any of our policies does not cover anything related to the pandemic. So what happens when an employee, says that they caught it from work, wants to make a comp claim, and the company is saying, no, we don't handle pandemics? Am I going to be responsible to pay for their medical costs?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think the proper way to do that is, I don't think you can prevent an employee, from filing a workers' comp claim, but I can tell you, based on conversations that we have, similar to the one that you had, Diane, from the insurance company perspective, or the workers' comp insurance perspective, they're going to fight these tooth and nail. They're not going to just start paying out on these claims. So I think probably the best thing to do is allow the employee, to file the claim, but then turn it over to the carrier and let them fight it.
Okay. I've been telling all of our chamber members and non-members and people on our webinars that this is the time that you should really try to invest in your company and hire a professional that can put together employee manuals, policy and procedure manuals, and keep people, in compliant and having the right paperwork to protect them. So that being said, one of the questions was, should I revise my employee manual and my policy manuals? What kind of policy should I have in place to protect my business from lawsuits?
A couple of things. One, it's depending on, I mean, most manuals, certainly any manual that we provide, provides the employer the opportunity to make changes to that manual with or without notice. So if your receptacle for that type of information is your handbook, and that's the best way to do it, certainly making amendments, adding policies with or without notice to the employees, and circulating that information is appropriate. We've also seen and counseled clients, with regard to establishing some separate COVID policies that will remain in existence as long as we're dealing with this pandemic. So you could create, a separate, an addendum to your handbook for COVID, and sort of house all the policies there. Or you could go through, it's a little bit more complicated, but you could go through and revise or supplement your existing handbook, because you have the right to do that at any time anyway. And just not a plug, but just really because we have really legitimate resources on our website. We have a return to work guide that's on there that you can take a look at. We've got all the return to work guidance, alerts, and some of our return to work guides address, the types of policies and procedures that you're going to want to put in place. And, you can look at that, but then consult with counsel as to, how to get those drafted. But you're absolutely going to want a return to work policy that addresses all the things that Valerie talked about in her summary, such as mask and social distancing, and whether you're going to temperature check, whether you're going to COVID check, things like that.
So obviously in the guidelines, it says I have to do employee training. Do you have any suggestions of the things, like the top 5 things I need to make sure I go over with my employees? And from me, I would say, what kind of documentation should they have? Do they need to get a set of the guidelines? Do you need to document their training? What are your suggestions there?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, should that definitely document the training, but if I understand the question, I mean, the top five, my recommendation would be to, either look at you can certainly look at some of the guidance that we've put out, or actually look at the state of Connecticut, Lamont's, return to work guidance. It's pretty well outlined, but you're going to want to have clear policies about the wearing of masks, about social distancing in the workplace, utilization of a break room or a lunch room, staggered shifts, all the things that Valerie talked about. I don't think those policies are hard to put together, but you're going to want to have them in writing. We at our firm did a policy, a written policy that will be circulated, just so everybody's on the same page about, certain things. What about out-of-state travel? We've had a lot of questions about, positive COVID tests or symptomatic employees. Stay home, stay safe. What are you going to do with your more vulnerable workforce? So I think it's necessary to create the policies. Where you house them is less important, as long as you circulate them.
Yeah, in Governor Lamont's guidelines, it says that all the training should cover all the rules that are in place based on your sector. So if you just go online to the portal and just use the guidelines as a template, that's what they're expecting for training, as well as the OSHA cleaning guidelines, and that's all. The link for that's also included in Lamont's sector guidelines. So if you have the sector guidelines for your specific business, then you should, that's a good place to start, and it kind of lays everything out.
Okay. So the Families First Act, you talked about tax credits and all kinds of other things for available. If my employee does not want to come back because they have children at home that they have to take care of, or they're taking care of somebody with COVID or any of those things, what kind of documentation or paperwork do I need to get from them in order to meet the requirements to get any of the tax credits and such that I might apply for?
Yeah, it's again, it's on our website, but it's really minimal. And I don't know, Valerie, if you can cite it from memory, but it's not a lot of documentation. I mean, if you're quarantined or if you're home with a child, you can't just stay home with a son or daughter because you don't have a daycare provider. You can stay home with a son or daughter if their school or daycare provider is closed due to COVID. And if that's the case, all they have to do is basically provide you with the name of the school. I don't even think they have to provide you with the name of their son or daughter, but
the name of the child, the name of the place of care, school, or care provider that is closed or become unavailable, and then also a statement that there's no other suitable person to care for the child, because that's another thing. I mean, you don't want both parents claiming benefits and staying home, so you have to have a statement by them saying that they are the sole provider during this time.
And it's pretty minimal for the paid sick leave as well.
Yeah.
Someone that does not want to come back to work, can I just replace them and hire someone else? And am I going to get in trouble for doing that later on?
Well, as you know, we're never going to tell you you're not going to get into trouble, but we can tell you that so much of it is a case-by-case analysis. These are hard questions because everything hinges on the particular facts of each situation. But you just need to have a sensible dialogue with your employee and figure out why he or she is not returning to work. As I mentioned earlier, not returning to work because you're afraid of contracting COVID is not really a legitimate reason to stay home. But you want to talk to the employee, have a dialogue, make sure that there's no protected disability, underlying the reason that they're staying home, or that there's not a Family First Response Act reason, in terms of having COVID or caring for someone with COVID or staying home with a son or daughter. But just a general, unwillingness to return to work is not a sufficient reason.
And,
Are they able to
Diana,
Go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead. I just want to jump in on something else before I forgot, but if you have a follow-up there, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, is it so that for whatever the reason, whether it's legitimate or not, I still have an opening, can I hire somebody to replace that person?
Oh, good point. I didn't answer the question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, after you go through that process, and you document it, and they're refusing to come to work, I think you're in a much better position. I would still communicate them. Oftentimes what we're doing is sort of, advising on that drop dead letter. Okay, here's your last chance. I need to fill this position. I need to hire someone to replace you. I will do so, on X date. A letter to that effect is going to give you a lot more protection. But the key now is more than ever is communication and dialogue with your employees and document it. And then I think under those circumstances, if someone refuses and you made it clear to them what you're going to do and they don't come back, then you're probably in pretty good shape.
And I know there's a couple of businesses that the person has to stay home for childcare reasons, and then the employer does not want to let them go. But they also, if they're going to open, have to have somebody fill that position. So it's a bad thing. They don't want to replace them, but in order to open, they have to. So, thank you. I'm sorry, Richard. Did you have?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to follow up a little bit on the liability issue. Chris talked about, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but that, if you don't have to document a negative temperature reading, for example, or someone doesn't have a temperature, whatever it is that you decide to do, just make sure that you do it consistently. The worst thing that you can have is a haphazard policy of only doing, not taking everyone's temperature when they come in, or just taking certain persons, or some days writing down the -1 and other days not doing it. You want to, whatever you decide to do, just make sure you do it on a very consistent basis. Because if someone claims and someone, does claim a workers' comp, that they got sick, and regardless of the, and again, I understand that these companies have pandemic exclusions and other things, but just like the business interruption, that could all be changed by legislation, or they may make a decision at some point that, we are going to cover this because, when you think about it, unless somebody gets seriously sick, from this, they're just going to be out for a week, maybe. There's now the problem is if it becomes, thousands of claims, then that's another issue. But again, you just have to, you just can't sort of rest on what the insurance companies are saying at this point, because things can change. But just to get back to my point, just make sure that you're very consistent, because if, some days you write down the negative temperature, some days you don't. Someone comes in on a Friday, you don't write anything down. They come back on Monday, they could say, well, I knew, I had a temperature last week, but nobody took it down. Obviously, you wrote down every other day, but this day you missed. You just have to be very consistent, or you're opening yourself up to the problem. So however you decide to do it, just make sure you do it, you do it well and you document things well.
Thank you. I think you guys also answered this, but I'll just ask it again. Can I pay someone a bonus for coming back to work under these conditions, or can I pay them hazard pay? And is that going to be forgivable and allowable under the PPP program, as long as it's paid in the 8 weeks and follows all the other guidelines?
Yes. Short answer to that is yes. That was specifically addressed in the interim final rule that was issued this past Friday. So yes.
Great, thank you. That was a question that we were waiting to get an answer for, so awesome. Contact tracing, everybody kind of knows what it is, but doesn't really know what it is. What are going to be my responsibilities for doing any kind of contact tracing? How does that work? Do I have to take names of customers that come into my restaurant or place of business? How do I deal with this?
I'll start and Valerie can chime in. I mean, I think the responsibility still remains to be, that if you have someone who is positive and they're quarantining, your obligation is to, ask them if they can identify those that they've been in close contact with within 6 feet within the last 48 hours.
Right.
Does that seem right, Valerie?
Yes.
So what about customers that come in to the store? I don't have to ask my customers any questions.
But I don't think you have to keep a log of every single person that comes into your workplace.
That affected employee may identify a customer.
Mhm.
You know, it's an interesting question. What if an employee says, well, I, served at, a table with 2 customers, but I have no idea what their names are. I think the obligation ends there. You ask the employee if they can identify everyone that they've come into close contact with. You may have an obligation to, if you're a restaurant, for instance, and that employee says, yeah, I served table 3, and you have in your reservation, list who was at table 3, you probably have an obligation to, to track them down. But it's really the main obligation is the information that you can obtain from your employee.
Mhm.
And a couple of questions, since we only have a few more minutes, I'm just going to kind of combine them. And it's all about, what if I don't follow the guidelines? What can happen to me? First of all, can I fire an employee if I find out they're not wearing their mask? Can I tell somebody they can't come into my restaurant or my place of business if they're not wearing a mask, even though the governor has said that you don't have to if you have a medical condition? Anything there on let me separate those questions.
Yeah, no, I think we can probably handle it. Again, it's the key is the sort of independent, take each case by case. I don't think I would recommend that you terminate an employee for not wearing a mask, but I might advise that termination is appropriate if you had that conversation 3 times and they don't have any medical justification for not wearing it. A lot of the same tried and true progressive disciplinary procedures come into play here in COVID, just like they did in the past. You want to document, you want to give a warning, maybe give a final warning, make sure it's in their personnel file. But ultimately, yeah, if someone's not in compliance with the guidelines and they're creating a direct threat to the safety of themselves and others and your customers, I think you can move to a termination. But you want to make sure that it's well documented and that they don't have a legitimate reason for doing what they did.
And how do I handle customers that come into my place of business that are not following the guidelines?
Yeah. I think the contacting the authorities ultimately is what needs to happen. I mean, obviously, everybody needs to work on their de-escalation tactics. We've all seen the news with the violent confrontations in restaurants and elsewhere. It's a time to be calm. It's a time to try to rationalize and communicate quietly, have a private conversation. But ultimately, if you have a customer who you think is disregarding the sector guidelines, at some point, I think you just need to turn it over to the authorities and let them make the decision.
At a municipal level, we've been handling this a lot in advising police departments and our municipal clients about enforcing these sector rules. And by and large, the first response is always going to be, a warning or some sort of educational response from the police or the health officials about what the rules are. After that, they're going to start to enforce. And we haven't quite seen that yet. But, I do think Chris is absolutely right. For the safety of your employees and for your other customers, you need to be following rules, and you have to enforce that as well.
And that's important from a liability perspective too. If you allow a customer to come into your place of business without wearing a mask, or someone who refuses to social distance, it becomes a problem. If they're there for an extended period of time and it becomes a real problem and you haven't done anything, then if someone eventually has a claim against you, that's certainly going to be a negative. You should show that you asked the person to leave, nicely. Then if they refuse, you contacted the authorities or did what you were supposed to do. In that situation, you should probably advise your other customers to distance themselves from that person as well.
So we've gone through most of the questions that were answered or asked, I'm sorry, and I don't see any others in the chat room. So if you have any final words, we'd love to hear. Anyone want to summarize or say a last final statement?
I just wanted to thank you for hosting us and having us here today, and also thank my partners. I've been smiling because the transition team, this is a lot to keep up with. They're coming out daily and they just do a really fine job, and I thank you thank you all for having the time this morning to inform the community and the chamber members. So really appreciate it. And thank you, Diane and Steve.
Well, I'll end by saying I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your very busy days to come here and talk to us. My final words of wisdom to people listening to this is the best protection is documentation, 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 and to know what you're doing. And the best way to know what you're doing is to consult professionals. So we highly recommend that if you do not already have an attorney for your company, that you really should invest in your business by working with someone to make sure that you are up to date on all of these things, because the SBA came out with new rules on Friday and didn't really make that announcement. So if you weren't paying attention, you might not have seen them. OSHA came out with new regulations. You might not have seen them. So it's really great to work with an attorney firm like Updike, Kelly, and Spellacy to make sure that they're following the rules appropriately. You guys are always open. Bonnie, you're listed on our website. If they want to get a hold of any of you, they can go through Bonnie and she'll send you to the right person. But we highly recommend that you consult with professionals in order to make sure you're following the guidelines and you're protected. So again, thank you all for coming. And for those of you at the webinar, stay safe and healthy. Keep listening and to our webinars and reading our newsletters. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane.
Have a good one.
Bye.